didn't run anyone off last week with Genesis, with Genesis 10, because probably be a little worse tonight. We emptied some chairs somehow, though. Here come some people in. Well, we had closed with the fact that I said there are a couple of interruptions here in our outline. Let's go back and give you the outline again, because we're going to be studying it. You might want to have it there, the forefront of your mind, for the table of nations in Genesis 10. An outline, we have an introduction in verse 1. These are the Toledot of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. So that's an introduction in verse 1. Then the body of the chapter comprises verses 2 through 31. And that has an A, B, C underneath it. For the Japhethites, verses 2 through 5. The Hamites, verses 6 through 20. And the Shemites, verses 21 through 31. And each verse to the conclusion of the sons section, namely verses 5, 20, and 31, serve as just that, a conclusion to that section, verses 5, 20, and 31. And then verse 32 is the conclusion for the whole chapter. Now that's what we'd given you just as we were wrapping things up last week. An introduction, the body, Japhethites, Hamites, Shemites, and then the conclusion. And we said that in this outline we have two interruptions, which is what we pick up with now. Those being the Nimrod interruption, verses 8 through 12, which fit under the Hamite section. Well, as a matter of fact, both interruptions fit under the Hamite section. And then verse 19, which speaks of the land of the Canaanites. Goes into the tale of giving you the land of the Canaanites, where really this is supposed to be a table of nations, of names of people, and not of territories. But we've got all of verse 19. The border of the Canaanites was from, and so forth, and it gives you a whole outline of the territory of the Canaanites. So those are our two interruptions. Now, since the names are, well, we've got more than 70 names here. They're quite plentiful in this chapter. What we're going to try to do is go name by name, because a lot of these names appear throughout the rest of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, and try to the best of our abilities as far as the material that we have left with us today to find out what group of people these names back in early Genesis 10 happen to represent. Now there are a couple of exceptions, or more than a couple of exceptions of names we're not going to look at. We might want to list those first of all. These are the names we're not going to look at for two reasons. Gomer, Magog. Can anyone guess yet why we're not going to look at those? Okay, that's eschatology. No, that's not next week. Maybe next decade we'll be getting to that. That's Ezekiel 38, Gog, Magog, Gomer, and all of those names. And if we got to that here, way back here in Genesis 10, we'd spoil the fun of the future. So, Gomer, Magog, Tubal, most of these you'll see come under the Japhethite section. Meshech, and Togarmah. And Put. Put comes under the Hamite section. We'll not be looking at that for the reason that you just guessed. Those of you that didn't guess, you can ask someone who did guess. And then we won't be looking at Nimrod, because we'll look at him when we get over to chapter 11. So Gomer, Magog, Tubal, Meshech, Togarmah, Put, and Nimrod. And if you read Ezekiel 38, you'll see a lot of these names pop up there, as well as some other ones one of, at least, that we're going to look at. There's some other names there that we won't be looking at, but you'll look in Ezekiel 38, as well as the book of Revelation, and you'll see some of these names pop up, occurring in the same chapter as a reference to end-time events in Israel. So to cover that would be way ahead of the story of the Table of Nations. Now, there are a couple of early scholars that we owe a debt to for doing a lot of early work on trying to identify these names. One of them 300 years ago. That was Samuel Bochart, B-O-C-H-A-R-T, 1650. And 200 years after him, 100 years ago from where we are, Carl Nobel, K-N-O-B-E-L, 1850. Now, Bochart and Noble didn't always agree on the identification of the names, and on many occasions we'll part company with either Bogart or Noble, or perhaps both of the men. But they did a lot of early studies on trying to identify some of these obscure names that we have here in chapter 10. And so a lot of the future studies that have been done, you see Bochart, that's 300 years ago. Hopefully someone's done some more advanced research since Bochart was born. But since these men, more studies have been done, but the studies that have occurred have been built upon this. Okay, in verses 2, 3, 4, and 5, we start our Japhethite section. Now, I've got several things to put up on the overhead to show you a family tree of these different families, to show you what names we'll be looking at and which ones we will not. Now this right here is a Japhethite tree. The Japhethites are Indo-European people, or sometimes also spoken of as our Eurasian people, where we get European nations, some of our Asian nations, as well as North America and Canada, and then just a whole bunch of other places that have branched off. But it's known in studies as the Indo-European or as the Eurasian family. Now, as we've intimated before, this is the group in Genesis 10 from whom we come. Just about everyone here, no doubt, is from the Japhethite section. So you might want to look up here. Up at the very top is the name of Japheth. We've got them enumerated through here, and we've got them totaled up over here because the numbers will become important later on. But we've got 7 sons: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus. Japheth is up here at the very extreme top, and he branches down into these 7 sons. Now you'll notice that only under 2 of his sons are sons given, which would be grandsons to Japheth, Gomer and Javan. Now obviously that does not mean that the other sons of Japheth didn't have sons themselves, but for whatever reason they're not included. The only ones important are the descendants that come from Gomer: Ashkenaz, Riphath, Togarmah, and those that come from Javan: Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. So in effect, what you have would be 7 sons, 7 grandsons, a total of 14 families, 14 names, 14 descendants, 14 nations, however you want to say it, that have descended from Japheth. Now we can't place every one of us here definitely under a certain name, because when you try to study from whom the Britons came, and then from whom the people that ended up being in England came, and going back and back and back, it's very difficult to tell. Some of them we can't, like Germany and the Scandinavian countries. We've got any blonde hair, blue eyes here that have Scandinavian blood, we can actually point out what name you're probably from. Now those of us with brown hair, brown eyes, we don't know. We're from Japheth, but we don't know which one of those names. But it's interesting that out of those 14 names, everyone here in this room, for the most part, has derived themselves. People spend a lot of money doing a lot of roots studies, and here the Bible's got a good study in roots. We just don't know which one there. But those that do spend a lot of money, and it costs quite a lot of money to find out who all your ancestors were, none of them can take you back this far. So the Bible can take you all the way back to Adam, you see. Amen. And roots can't do that. Roots will take you back to an amoeba in a swamp if you don't watch out. But for the most part, you see, I can't speak for everyone here, but I came from one of those names: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshech, Tyrus. I mean, I know some of them that I couldn't have come from, and some of them that are more likely than others, but we're not doing a study in roots, so don't everyone come up here and ask who you came from. We'll just do a study here in the names here, and if you want to find out your roots, and you can pick up from there. And besides that, we can add a little New Testament in there. We've all been born again, so we know where we can trace our roots back to. We've got a heavenly Father, that we were begotten by the word of truth. Hallelujah. So that's even better than Japheth or all the rest of them. Now, we'll leave it up there a little bit longer and give you time to get it down. The other ones, of course, will be longer because the Japhethite section is the shortest section. Why? It's the section that doesn't come into play with Israel for the most part in the rest of her history. Remember, the Hamites do, and other Shemites do, so we've got a greater enumeration of names as far as the Hamites and Japhethites are concerned, or as far as the Hamites and Shemites are concerned. But verses 2 through 4 really are all the names that we have for Japheth. That's because they branched on off into Europe and branched up into Asia and branched over to North America, and Israel didn't come into contact with them, so there was not a lot of need of going into a long list of names under Japheth. We're also going to put a map up and progressively show you around where each of these groups of people would be found. We'll do it on a number system, so you'll have to have the correct number by all the names, even those that we don't look at, in order to be able to find what name you're talking about on the map. We're going to go pretty much in line with what we have here in chapter 10. So that means we start off with Gomer, which means we really don't start off with Gomer because he's one of the ones that we are not going to cover. That brings us to Magog, number 2. We're not going to cover Magog either. So Japhethite section will be easy to get through. I don't really know how far we'll get through these tonight, but we'll go as long as time allows. So number 3 brings us to Madai. You'll probably get fairly familiar with these names as we study. You probably are to some degree anyway. You probably can't list all of the names under every father, every forefather, but if a name was given to you, you should be able to pick out whether it's a Japhethite, a Hamite, or a Shemite. That's fairly easy to do, if you take enough time to look and to study. Now, if you'll put this map up there, that has to go on there in a side direction. We'll begin to show you where some of these are found. Now, on number 3, which is Madai. Now, on some of these, we can give you other text in the Bible where the names happen to occur. They all occur in Genesis 10 and 1 Chronicles 1. So those will be texts we don't give you. You can look in Genesis 10 because some of them, like Canaan, occur several times in Genesis 10 as well as Genesis 9. We'll give the places to you that are outside Genesis 10 or 1 Chronicles 1. And if the names were a little indefinite as far as being certain on the correlation between the name in Genesis 10 and the people, then we'll mention that. Such is not the case with Madai. Madai happens to refer to the Medes that are referred to throughout the Old Testament that live just due south of the Caspian Sea. Now here's your scale to go by over here. The Japhethites will be in this color, the Hamites and the Shemites. You have to follow along with numbers. We can't possibly get all the names up on a small map. I don't even have all the numbers yet, just as many possibly as we can get through tonight. Now, do you recognize that map, everyone? Okay, that is a relief. You should remember this from a whole lot of things, but especially from Book of Acts, because we had this whole section up there many times, and Old Testament, we had this section up here many times, so we're just putting it together. But for those of you that aren't familiar, I've got the names of the seas here. The Persian Gulf over here. This is where Solomon's port was at Aqaba. This, of course, is Tigris and Euphrates River. This is the Arabian Gulf that generally you're more familiar with the name Red Sea, so I put Red Sea on there, but this is the Arabian Gulf. This is the Arabian Peninsula. We'll be speaking a lot about Arabia. Arabia proper is up here, and this is the Arabian Peninsula. And of course today it's Saudi Arabia. Not this down here, but this major section is Saudi Arabia, so it goes by a similar name. This is the Arabian Sea, and then it empties into the Indian Ocean. Over here you've got Egypt, Nile River. This, of course, was Babylon, Assyria, Medes, and the Persians. What we're on right now is Madai. And it's the same, essentially the same Hebrew word that's translated Mede, such as Darius the Mede in Daniel's book, and the Medo-Persian kingdom and empire in Esther's book, and what we see throughout the end of the Old Testament. Just due south of the Caspian Sea. Now my map is not perfect, so everything is not exactly to scale, like probably Caspian should be a little further south, but I don't know, I like sitting at home making these things up, so I trust that they don't bore you as we get to them. Black Sea, you remember Mount Ararat that we've looked at in creation is around this general area. Here's Israel, Mediterranean Sea, Greece, Asia Minor, Italy, and so forth. Now you'll probably only be able to copy that down in between the names as we go along, but it'd be good to get it down because you definitely won't find one just like this anywhere else, because we all have our differences of opinion on where you're going to locate each one of these names. So you can look up a table of nations and, well, just a whole lot of books, like a book on archaeology, and it probably won't have the numbers or the names in that case in the same place as you might have them here. As a matter of fact, I know they won't, not on all of the names. On some of them they will, but as you'll see, in some of the cases, there's a great diversity of opinion on where these people should be placed. So I recommend that you get down whatever you can. So Madai, number 3, refers to the Medes. Now remember that the Japhethite people refer to the Indo-European or the Eurasian people, and this, of course, is in Asia, so you might thought that the Medes were similar to the Israelites. You know, they're both over in the Near East, the Middle East, but they come from two different strains of people entirely, a Shemite and a Japhethite. Okay, the next name we come to is Javan. Javan was the ancient Homeric name, Homer the poet of the Greeks, when it's translated over into the Hebrew, for the Ionian Greeks. This again is a fairly definite correlation between the Ionian Greeks and the Javanites, or the people of Javan, which would be number 4, who lived in western proconsular Asia, right here. Now, if you're alert, you should be thinking, well, that's Asia Minor and Greece is all the way over there. But this refers to Ionian Greeks. Well, at a future time, they migrated over to Achaia, which is the southern part of Greece, and established themselves there. Now, you can kind of see a similarity between the names Javan and Ionian, I-O-N-I-A-N, because you can compare the name of Jesus, which is a Greek name, and whenever you look back into the Greek, of course it's transliterated into the English, it begins with an I. But we end up with it as a J. The Hebrews, with the name Joshua, end up with it with a J as well, as far as the way the Old Testament has been translated. So the I from Ionian would go right over to the J of Javan. Now, they are seen in a couple of other passages by the name Javan in the Old Testament. Ezekiel 27. Most of these passages we'll turn at and look to see what it says about them. Ezekiel 27, verses 13 and 19. Now, it's the same word that's translated Greeks or Grecians throughout the Old Testament, and only on a couple of occasions do they give it to us as Javan. That's just all at the discretion of the translators. Ezekiel 27, verse 13, we'll be coming back to this chapter a lot because you can see all the names. This chapter is about Tyre, and you can see all the names of people who were great traders that traded with Tyre. And here you can spot some from Genesis 10 and verse 13 right away. Javan, Tubal, and Meshach. They were thy merchants. They traded the persons of men, means they were traders in slaves. They were slave traders. And vessels of brass in thy market. Then down in verse 19, Dan also and Javan going to and fro, occupied in thy fairs, that is the marketplaces, the trading marts. Bright iron, cassia, calamus were in thy market. So it tells us right away that whoever Javan is, it has to be a trading colony of people. And this generally will help us spot, at least if not who it could be, who it definitely couldn't be. And it certainly could refer to the Ionian Greeks, and of course we know that it does because they were a trading people. And then in Isaiah 66 and verse 19. We've done most of the homework for you, so you don't have to spend hours and hours and hours like I did in a concordance and in Hebrew dictionaries trying to find, and in Aramaic dictionaries, trying to find all these names. We're going to let you look for one people yourself because there are too many of them. I couldn't write all of them down. Isaiah 66 and 19, we again see a lot of these names mentioned. I will set a sign among them, and I will send those that escape of them unto the nations of Tarshish, Pul, and Lud, that draw the bow to Tubal and Javan, to the isles afar off, that have not heard my fame, neither have seen my glory, and they shall declare my glory among the Gentiles. Now, if you'll turn over to, let's see, I believe it's Joel 3, just to show you that the same word appears here, but it's translated different. Joel chapter 3 and verse 6 is translated as Grecians here. It really doesn't matter which way you have it as long as you know that it's referring to a specific tribe, an early tribe of the Greeks known as the Ionian Greeks, that in the first place didn't live in Greece, but they lived in western proconsular Asia. In other words, right on the coast of the Aegean Sea. The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians. Well, again, we see them as slave traders here, that ye might remove them far from their border, which shows that all the way back in Joel's day, 835 BC, we've got people that are already being sold from the nation of Israel to the traders from Greece. Now, it is also a possibility that this early Greek Ionian tribe could refer to the famous Mycenaean civilization. That if you've ever done any studies about the Greeks, the Mycenaean civilization was one of the forerunners of the Greeks that possibly could refer to the Ionians themselves. So that's not definite, but that's a possibility. Okay, we go on next to Tubal, which we pass up. Meshach, which we pass up. Number 7 is Tyrus. Now, Tyrus is the last son that's mentioned in Genesis 10:2 of Japheth, which number 7 shows you as you refer back to the first chart we had up there. Japheth had 7 sons: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tyrus, Tyrus being the last of those. Now, this name is not very definite. Josephus and most commentators tell us that Tyrus refers to a pirate nation on the northern shore of the Aegean Sea. And they perhaps were the forerunners of the Thracians, Thracians, from whom the Scandinavians came. Now, Thrace is a part of northern Greece, which is right here. This is where Thrace is. You can even look on your maps in the back of your Bible probably and find that very name, Thrace, there. You won't find Tyrus, but you will find Thrace. And so it's possible that since Josephus and most of the commentators that have done study on this refer it to a pirate nation of the Aegean Sea, since this is the Aegean Sea, it's got to be somewhere, either over west of here, up north, or east of there. It's got to be somewhere around the Aegean Sea. And some of the commentators point out that possibly they are the originators of the Thracians, which would put them north of the Aegean Sea. Number 8, Ashkenaz. Now with Ashkenaz, we began the sons of Gomer. Remember, 2 of the sons of Japheth, Gomer and Javan, were we given their sons from. Verse 3, verse 4 of chapter 10. Gomer has Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. We're going to look at the first 2, Ashkenaz, Riphath. We'll skip Togarmah. He appears over in Ezekiel 38. And then we go to the sons of Japhan, Elisha, Tarshish, Kittim, and Rodanim. Now, Ashkenaz is the name that the modern Jews apply to Germany. But this couldn't possibly be true because of the one biblical reference we have to Ashkenaz over in Jeremiah 51, verse 27. Germany came from one of those nations that we're not going to be looking at, so that's why I won't come up with Germany anywhere in the future. But the modern Jews say that Germany came from Ashkenaz. Jeremiah 51:27 is the only other place where this appears, and it puts it over in the area of Ararat, which is too far away from Germany to be applied to Germany. As a matter of fact, this places it between, evidently, the Caspian and the Black Seas. Set ye up a standard in the land, blow the trumpet among the nations, prepare the nations against her, call together against her the kingdoms of Ararat, Minai, and Ashkenaz. So probably it's going to refer to kingdoms that are all somewhere in the same area. This is number 8, which would be placed up a little bit north of Ararat, Ashkenaz. They were a horse-riding, raiding, nomadic type people. Probably the same people as the Scythians that aren't mentioned in the Old Testament, but that are mentioned in many, many monuments left from the Assyrians and from the Babylonians. Scythians, the Scythians, were a warlike, nomadic, horse-riding, raiding group of people. And probably the Scythians came from Ashkenaz. Now, the Scythians aren't mentioned in the Old Testament by name, but it does appear that there are references to them both in the books of Jeremiah and Zephaniah, because we see several different raiding groups of people in Jeremiah and Zephaniah which aren't mentioned by name, but which probably refer to the Scythians, because we know that in the year 611 BC, they raided all of Mesopotamia and almost took over Egypt until Egypt finally bought them off with gold and silver and jewels to go back home. They were a powerful people. As a matter of fact, they were the ones that helped bring about the downfall of great Nineveh just a year before that in 612, which would put them over in the book of Nahum as well. That just comes to mind. That means they'd be covered in the book of Nahum as well, but not by name. But there does appear to be references, because If you notice the first two prophets, Jeremiah, Zephaniah, and you remember their dates from O.T. Encro, this is around when they're prophesying the end of the 7th century B.C. And the monuments state that they did come down and raid the territory in 611 B.C. They are mentioned in the book of 2nd Maccabees. They are mentioned over in the New Testament, surprisingly enough, over in the book of Colossians. Colossians chapter 3, we have our only reference in the Bible to the Scythians that are probably descendants from Ashkenaz. Now you might want to look, because it's a little difficult, the text here, because one thing we know, the primary characteristic of the Scythians is their barbarian nature. Now you have to keep that in mind. If you remember, they're horse riders, raiders, nomadic people. Their primary characteristic is that they are very barbaric people. Now, the problem with that is, if you look here in Colossians 3, in verse 11, we raise the question, is Paul mentioning a contrast between each of the two sets of names that are referred to here, which appears to be the case, or could there be one exception? Now look and you'll see what I mean. Now the problem with that is, if you look here in Colossians 3, in verse 11, we raise the question, is Paul mentioning a contrast between each of the two sets of names that are referred to here, which appears to be the case, or could there be one exception? Now look and you'll see what I mean. Where there is neither Greek nor Jew. Looks like he's contrasting. Well, obviously, he's contrasting between Gentiles and Jews, circumcision nor uncircumcision. You skip down to the last one, bond nor free. But then right in the middle, barbarian, Scythian. Probably, since it does have a comma and doesn't have a nor, when we get to barbarian and Scythian, there's no longer a contrast here. He simply mentions the Scythians as being the most outstanding and notable barbarians that anyone in that part of the world could think of. Because all the other names here refer to a contrast. Gentile and Jew, those that are circumcised, those that are uncircumcised, the free man and the slave. And then you'd think, well, the barbarian as opposed to the Scythian, but the Scythian is a barbarian, so that wouldn't fit here. But noticeably, we don't have the word nor, and we do have a comma here, which puts the two in a similar relationship as opposed to an opposite relationship. And Paul would simply be referring to the Scythians, although they've passed off the scene by this time, as being one of the most memorable barbaric people of the ancient world that the people in Asia Minor at Colossae would have been familiar with from history. Okay, number 9, moving right along. We come to Riphath, who's the second son of Gomer, of course the grandson of Japheth. You look over in the 1 Chronicles 1 text, some versions have it in the text, some in the margin, the name spelled with a D, Diphath, instead of with an R. 1 Chronicles 1, I don't know what it will be. Well, it's in the margin here. I don't know where it is on yours. 1 Chronicles 1 and verse 6. The D and the R are very similar letters in Hebrew, and probably what we have here in 1 Chronicles in the margin or in the text, depending on where Diphath occurs for you, is a scribal error. It should be an R rather than a D, which is what I've got in the text. But in the margin you've got a D, and that's wrong. That's no doubt a scribal error, because a D and an R are very similar in Hebrew. Josephus, we have to go back to him for one guess on what this name refers to. Josephus said that it referred to the Paphlagonians in Asia Minor. Paphlagonians. The Paphlagonians in Asia Minor, which I believe lived on Bithynia Pontus area, which is on the southern shore of the Black Sea. Well, we don't have the number there because that's probably not right. A better guess puts them all the way up here, northwest of the Black Sea, in an area that was known to the ancient Greeks as the Riphean Mountains, which were legendary. They never did even exist. By that name, anyway, the Riphean Mountains, Riphaean, that the ancient Greek geographers felt was the border of the northern world. You went past the Riphean Mountains, you would, of course, fall off the world. You'd be past the world then. Today, they are actually known as the Carpathian Mountains in northeastern Romania. Carpathian. But since the Greeks did have in their geographic writings and details the name of a mountain chain known as the Riphean Mountains or the Riphean Mountains, and this name Riphath is very similar, probably it's because this group of people were there. One other guess, which would be off of our map, would put it up here. I guess it would be right around here on your map, which is up in the Soviet Union, and that's the most famous north-south mountain chain in the Soviet Union known as the Ural Mountains, U-R-A-L, which blocks Moscow off from the rest of the Soviet Union. It's a huge mountain chain that runs right down that part of the Soviet Union. That's probably not true. The best guess is up here northwest of Black Sea, Riphath. Togarma, last son of Gomer, number 10, is one we pass up. Number 11 brings us to our first son of Javan. Now, I just say first in order that we have here in Genesis 10. Of course, we don't know really who was first born. Number 11, that's Elisha. He's mentioned over in Ezekiel 27 and verse 7. Ezekiel 27:7. Fine linen with broidered work from Egypt was that which thou spreadest forth to be thy sail, speaking of Tyre. Blue and purple from the isles of Elisha was that which covered thee. So it speaks of an island or a coastland, someone who is accessible by sea. Josephus identifies the descendants of Elisha with the Aeolians, A-E-O-L-I-A-N-S, the Aeolians, which were the forerunners of the earliest tribe of Thessalonians in northeastern Greece. That's one guess on where we'd put Elisha. Another guess prefers the Peloponnese, which of course you know from Acts is this extension from the country of Greece, the Peloponnese. Why? Because the Peloponnese was world famous in that day for purple dye. And if you notice, our text there in Ezekiel speaks of blue and purple dye. And for another reason, because there was a district on the Peloponnese known as Elis, E-L-I-S, which is very similar. As a matter of fact, it's the first half of Elisha. But a better guess places it as being the northern part of the island of Cyprus, because this is what it is referred to in the Amarna letters, A-M-A-R-N-A, which were letters found in ancient Egypt. And we know from ancient history, as well as from places like Acts chapter 27, that the Egyptians in their travel and trade routes had quite a lot to do, not only with this region right here around the island of Cyprus, but Asia Minor, as well as Greece, as well as Italy. So since that's the name of that part of the island that's found in the Amarna letters, and the Amarna letters were found down here, and Egypt did a lot of trade with the island of Cyprus, probably Egypt knew what she was talking about in referring to the northern part of the island of Cyprus as Elisha. Now that's just the northern part, because we've got another number here that's going to refer to another part. I don't know if you can read the numbers well. We're on number 11, which would put Elisha right here. Okay, We go on back to chapter 10 of Genesis, and verse 4 brings us to a name that is very frequent in the Old Testament, and that's Tarshish. Let me just give you the text first of all, because there are quite a few of them where Tarshish appears in the Old Testament. The following places: 2 Chronicles 9:21, chapter 20, verses 36 and 37, Psalm 48:7, Psalm 72:10, Isaiah 2:16, Isaiah 21, verses 1, 6, 10, and 14, Isaiah 60 and verse 9, 66, 19, Jeremiah 10:9, Ezekiel 27, verse 12, verse 25, Ezekiel 38:13, and where else can you guess that name appears in the Old Testament? No Old Testament. There's one particular prophet that his whole ministry is bound up with this one place. That's where he tried to escape to. Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 verse 3, Jonah chapter 4 and verse 2. And I'll give you two other references here in a moment. Most of these references speak of this place, Tarshish, as being a great commercial center, which was a very important trade link with the country of Phoenicia. Now, you know where Phoenicia is. Phoenicia is this area just north of Israel. And of course, Phoenicia was world known, Tyre and Sidon, for their boating expeditions, their great ships that they had, and so forth. As a matter of fact, Solomon's ships were actually built by builders that had come from Phoenicia for him, because Israel didn't know a lot about sailing. So the point is, since it was a great trading center that somehow was linked with Phoenicia, it has to be somewhere on the Mediterranean Sea. In other words, it can't put it back in this way, because Phoenicia didn't travel by land, she traveled by sea. You notice the far number over there on the very left-hand side of the screen. We don't even have it on our map because we don't have enough room, but it points you west from there. Tarshish was a melting center on the coast of Spain, which puts it a long way off from Phoenicia. It's a smelting port where we get rich metals that were sent back to Phoenicia that of course had to be smelted, such as silver, iron, tin, and lead. That's in one of your Old Testament texts there. Now Josephus guessed, just by the name Tarshish, that it referred to Tarsus. You know, Paul, Tarsus here in Cilicia. That's not true. Another guess was that it was Sardinia, one of the islands there just west of Rome, but that's probably not true. Most people refer this name Tarshish to Spain. Now, in two places in the Old Testament, it's spelled Tharshish with an H, and the H should be marked out. It's spelled T-H-A-R-S-H-I-S-H. 1 Kings 10:22 and 22:48. It's spelled Tharshish instead of Tarshish, and the H should be marked out. Now let's just take a look at some of these passages. Psalm 48 and verse 7. The ships that were sent from Phoenicia to Tarshish and then back were so famous that they actually became symbolic for all great sailing ships. Psalm 48 and verse 7 says, "Thou breakest the ships of Tarshish with an east wind." If you want to speak of, a great mighty act of God on the sea, then tell about him breaking those ships of Tarshish, because they were practically unbreakable. They were such sturdy ships that had been built by the cedars in Lebanon, which of course was Phoenicia of that day. Then in chapter 72 and verse 10, "The kings of Tarshish And of the isles shall bring presents, the kings of Sheba and Seba shall offer gifts. So we've got a kingly settlement as well as a smelting port here in Spain. Isaiah chapter 60 and verse 9. We're not going to take the time to look at all of these, but chapter 60 and verse 9. Surely the isles shall wait for me, and the ships of Tarshish first, to bring thy sons from far, their silver, their gold with them, unto the name of the Lord thy God, and to the Holy One of Israel, because he hath glorified thee. Now in the LXX translation of the Old Testament, it renders this word Tarshish as Carthage, which was the ancient port right around here that was always in warfare with Rome in the centuries just before the time of Christ. In the text in 2 Chronicles chapter 9 verse 21, let's turn over there for a moment. 2 Chronicles 9:21. We have a reference here to the time of Solomon, when he was in a league with Phoenicia. And notice that not only did Phoenicia, but also the Israelites, of course with the help of the Phoenician sailors, travel once every 3 years to this ancient place, Tarshish. 2 Chronicles 9:21. The king's ships went to Tarshish with the servants of Huram. Now he was the king up in Phoenicia. Every 3 years, once came the ships of Tarshish bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes and peacocks. So it was a great trading enterprise that people were involved in, whether in Phoenicia or in Israel, with Tarshish. Number 13, we come to Kittim. Kittim spelled with a K here in Genesis 10, and I think in 1 Chronicles 1. In all other places in the Old Testament, it's spelled with a CH. The CH should be changed back to a K. Now, there's no doubt whatsoever about Kittim. Kittim referred to the eastern shore of Cyprus to begin with, and then it referred to the whole island together. Now, there's no doubt, everyone agrees with that Kittim refers, first of all, to the eastern shore of the island of Cyprus, and then to the whole island. That would be number 13. Kittim, number 13. Okay, it's seen in Jeremiah 2, in verse 10, Ezekiel 27:6, Isaiah 23, verses 1 and 12. And then we've got two unusual texts where it appears, one in Numbers, one in Daniel. And it appears to be the case that in both of these passages, Numbers 24:24 and Daniel 11:30, that the name is used in a wider sense to refer to Rome. Because we do know that the people of Kittim that ended up here in Cyprus did eventually travel over to Italy and founded groups there. And of course, then finally the Etruscans came, and then the Romans came from the Etruscans and so forth. Such as these texts that we have. Numbers 24 and verse 24 is the earliest reference. Now this is a future prophecy that's covered here, that's given by Balaam in Numbers 24:24. Well, let's see, verse 23, he took up this parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God doeth this? And ships shall come from the coast of Kittim. Now it should be spelled with a K there. And you see where it says coast, right away it lets us know it's either an island or it's on the Mediterranean coast. And shall afflict Ashur, which is another name for Assyria. And we know that people from Kittim, from Cyprus, never came and defeated the Assyrians or defeated anyone who lived in Assyria, but the Romans certainly did. So probably in this text it's used in a wider sense to refer to the Romans. Now the other text is Daniel 11 and verse 30, and it appears like the same thing is true over here in Daniel 11:30, that it's used in a broader sense than just with the island of Cyprus. For the ships of Kittim, CH should be a K again, shall come against him, therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant, so shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsake the holy covenant. Again, people in Cyprus never attacked anyone, so it's got to refer to someone who descended from the people that ended up in Cyprus, and probably this refers to Rome. Okay, now you might want to turn back to Genesis 10 for number 14, because here again we have a scribal error with a confusion between the Hebrew letters R and D. And here you've got your correct rendition in the margin. Rodanim rather than Dodanim. Genesis 10, verse 4, the last mentioned son of Javan. Rodanim is in the margin, Dodanim is in the text. Let's see, I don't know, I'll have to look in 1 Chronicles 1 to see what we have there. You might have it correct in 1 Chronicles. Well, it's the same as Genesis. You've got the correct thing in your margin, and you've got Dodanim in the text. So it needs to be changed to an R. It's a scribal error. Now, since some people have seen that in both of these passages the D is maintained in the text rather than in the margin, then there have been two guesses in this area, and of course both wrong because the name doesn't start with the D. One guess was the Dardanians in Asia Minor. Another guess was a city called Dodona, D-O-D-O-N-A, in northwest Greece. But since probably what we have here is an R rather than a D, then neither one of these could be true because they do both start with a D. The best guess, and this is probably better than a guess, number 14, what's that island called right there that Paul sailed by? Rhodes. R-H-O-D-E-S, Rhodes. So, probably, this is where we can locate the Rodanim on the island of Rhodes. Number 14, which would be right there. I don't have the island marked. It's so small in comparison to Crete down here and Cyprus to the east of it. Okay, that brings us to a conclusion of Japheth, except for the concluding verse of that section, which we want to look at now and look at a lot of texts that back up this verse. It's very interesting. I saw this a long time ago in the Old Testament, so I want to share this with you. Chapter 10, verse 5. Do you remember last time when we were looking at verses 20 and 31, we saw a fourfold division with tongues, races, political empires, and lands? But in verse 5, the second half, which is the part we read, everyone a tongue, family, nation, which is missing the lands. Well, the lands is in the first part of the verse. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands. Now that particular word, right away, first of all, what this verse tells us is that all Japhethites are Gentiles. Now, of course, the same is true with Hamites, but at least it tells us this right away, that all Japhethites are Gentiles, and it mentions them here. But it mentions them with the reference, the isles of the Gentiles. And this little phrase, isles, sometimes isles of the Gentiles, sometimes isles of the nations, refers to these Indo-European people that first of all were located either on an island. Now the word doesn't necessarily mean an island. It was an island as far as a traveler on a ship of those days was concerned. When you come up on a landmass, it's an island, a continent, you don't know. I mean, until you sail all the way around it, you couldn't find out. But on some occasions, it actually refers to a specific island here, like the island of Cyprus, like the island of Rhodes. Other places, it refers to probably some type of coastland, some Mediterranean coastland, and then from there, these people spread out, and they actually became the people that now live in North America. as well as the people that are in Europe. Now let me give you some of the references here where we see it mentioning isles of the Gentiles. Most of these are in the book of Isaiah. Most of them are prophetic references to the fact that the gospel would eventually spread to the isles. And he's using that term, as well as the other authors who use it, with the understanding of Genesis 10:5, so that you'll realize that he's speaking of Japhethites here. And of course that becomes important when you remember the prophecy that was given to Japheth, that the gospel would eventually come to him as he would dwell in the tents of Shem. Most of the references are prophetic references because they do refer to the gospel being spread abroad. Such as Isaiah 11 verse 11. Not all of these are, but let's take a look at some of these. Isaiah 11:11 to begin with, because most of these are found in the book of Isaiah. Now here I believe it's translated islands of the sea, which is the same thing as isles of the Gentiles. Now this is a very, very important Old Testament verse for many, many, many reasons. So after saying that, hopefully that'll stress to you, don't forget what Isaiah 11:11 says. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, from Cush will be coming to that, from Elam will be coming to that, from Shinar will be coming to that, from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Now, of course, this is speaking about the present-day restoration of the nation of Israel, and the islands of the sea refer to all of those foreign Gentile nations, such as North America and Canada, and even all of our European nations, because although not all of them are actually a coastline now, the people that live there came from one of the islands or from one of the coastlines on the Mediterranean Sea. They eventually spread out in that area. So Isaiah 11:11, 24:15. Wherefore glorify ye the Lord in the isles of the sea. Chapter 40 and verse 15. Behold, the nations, now speaking of nations, remember that's what Genesis 10 is about. The nations are as a drop of the bucket and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. Then 41:5. The isles saw it and feared. The ends of the earth were afraid and drew near and came. Chapter 42. Verse 4, which is a prophecy of Christ. He shall not fail nor be discouraged till he have set judgment in the earth, and the isles shall wait for his law. Clear reference to Gentile salvation in the Old Testament. Then verse 10, sing unto the Lord a new song, and his praise from the end of the earth, ye that go down to the sea, and all that is therein, the isles and the inhabitants thereof. You see, to ancient Israel, that simply referred to the island of Cyprus and Rhodes and so forth. That's all the isles they knew of. But eventually those people spread out. Chapter 49, verse 1. Another prophecy of Christ. Listen, O isles, unto me, and hearken, ye people. From far the Lord hath called me from the womb. From the bowels of my mother hath he made mention of my name. 51:5. See, we'll use these texts in the future to prove that Gentile salvation was already pointed out clearly in many, many references in the Old Testament. But you would have had to have known that the isles referred to Genesis 10:5. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided. You'd have to know that isles refers to Gentile nations, and more specifically to Japhethite Gentile nations. 51:5, my righteousness is near, my salvation is gone forth, and my arm shall judge the people. The isles shall wait upon me, and on my arm shall they trust. Then in chapter 60 and verse 9, surely the isles shall wait for me. 66:19, Jeremiah 25:22, Jeremiah 31 verse 10. Then it's used in Ezekiel chapters 26 and 27 to refer to specific Mediterranean nations, so it's not so prophetic in Ezekiel 26 and 27 as in the other passages. And then one final one that, if I remember correctly, is prophetic is over in the book of Zephaniah, Zephaniah chapter 2 and verse 11. Yes, this is another one of the prophetic texts here. Zephaniah 2:11. The Lord will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the heathen. So it's another prophetic text that again speaks of this same group of people, Gentile nations that in the future will be converted.
For a complete